I was standing in front of my wife's casket when her boss pulled me aside, without offering a single word of condolence. He leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Don't go home. Don't sign anything your son gives you. And please, don't drink coffee anymore." I hadn't even had time to ask him what he meant when he tightened his grip on my hand, his eyes so panicked that my skin broke out in goosebumps. Just a few hours later, my son placed a thick stack of papers in front of me, saying his mother had prepared everything long ago. I nodded and let it pass. But that very night, I left my own house through the basement door, carrying a chill down my spine. My wife didn't die from illness, and maybe I was next. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. My name is Richard Coleman, 71 years old. And that morning I had just buried the woman who had slept beside me for 44 years. The funeral home in the suburbs of Pennsylvania was suffocatingly quiet. Not the comforting kind of quiet, but a heavy silence, as if every sound was afraid of shattering something fragile. The scent of white lilies mixed with the polished wood of the casket dried out my throat. Helen lay there, peaceful to a frightening degree. Her face was carefully made up, far too perfect compared to the pale, exhausted months at the end of her life that I had grown used to seeing. I stood beside the casket for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just looked at her hands folded over her chest, hands that had held mine through countless harsh winters, through nights I stayed awake in the woodworking shop, through the years we worried about Mark's college tuition. 44 years. I thought I understood every breath that woman took. Then Jonathan Reed appeared behind me. I had only met him a handful of times in my life. Helen's boss. A successful man, always neatly dressed, careful with his words, eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. At the funeral, he stood out in an unsettling way. He didn't cry. He didn't shed a tear. But he wasn't indifferent either. His gaze was uneasy. Jonathan didn't place a hand on my shoulder or say, "My condolences," like everyone else. He simply leaned in and motioned for me to follow him. I assumed he wanted to say a few words about Helen's work, about how important she had been to the company. I was ready to listen to those polite remarks. But what he said changed the rest of my life. When he tightened his grip on my wrist, I felt as if I were being yanked out of reality. The words, "Don't drink coffee anymore," sounded meaningless, even absurd, if not for the look in his eyes, exactly like someone who had just witnessed a fatal accident and didn't dare scream. Before I could ask anything else, Mark stepped closer. My son, Mark Coleman, 42 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed neatly in a black suit. His face wasn't red and swollen the way I had expected. There was no look of collapse from someone who had just lost his mother, just exhaustion and a hint of impatience I couldn't quite name. Laura, his wife, stood right behind him. She kept glancing at her watch, phone in hand, yet never texting. I realized it much later, but looking back now, I understand. They were waiting for a moment. The funeral ended faster than I expected. People came up one by one, hugged me, and repeated the same phrases. She passed peacefully. You need to take care of yourself. God has called her home. I nodded, forced a faint smile, and did exactly what a widower was supposed to do. But inside my head, Jonathan Reed's words kept looping. Don't go home, don't sign anything, and don't drink coffee. That afternoon, Mark drove me back to the house Helen and I had lived in for more than 3 decades. A 2-story wooden house with a backyard full of red maple trees. I had built every stair, every door with my own hands. Every scratch on the banister carried its own story. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. Not because Helen was gone. I had braced myself for that emptiness, but because it was too tidy. too orderly. Everything seemed rearranged, as if someone had prepared the house for something else, not for a grieving man returning from his wife's funeral. Laura set a cup of tea in front of me, not coffee. I looked at the cup, then at her. Laura smiled, a smile so gentle it was almost emotionless. "I think you should drink tea today," she said. "You're exhausted." I nodded. I didn't object. I was too tired to think. Less than 10 minutes later, Mark brought out a thick stack of papers, clipped inside a dark blue folder. He placed it on the dining table, right where Helen used to sit every morning. "Dad," Mark said, his voice low and slow, "these are some documents Mom prepared in advance. She didn't want you worrying about legal matters right now." I looked at the stack. Very thick. Too thick for routine paperwork. "You don't need to sign anything tonight," Laura added gently. "Just look them over so you feel at ease." Look them over. I had signed hundreds of documents in my life. Wood contracts, invoices, insurance, taxes. I knew the smell of printed paper and dry ink well. But when I picked up that folder, my hand suddenly trembled. Something wasn't right. I said I was tired. Said I wanted to rest. Mark nodded too quickly. Laura immediately stood up and said she would prepare my room. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. The wall clock ticked steadily, a sound I had lived with for decades, but now it made me tense. I heard whispers from the kitchen downstairs. Soft footsteps, a drawer opening and closing. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I recognized Mark's voice, not the gentle voice of a son caring for his father. A lower, sharper voice, impatient. A feeling of being watched crept under my skin. Around 2 a.m., I sat up, my heart pounding. I remembered Jonathan Reed's eyes, remembered his warning about coffee, remembered the blue folder on the table. I didn't turn on the light. I put on my jacket, slipped my wallet and phone into my pocket. I didn't go out the front door. I went down to the basement, where I used to keep my woodworking tools. The basement door creaked softly as it opened. A familiar sound that night felt like a warning. When I stepped outside, the cold air cut into my lungs. I took a deep breath, and for the first time that day, I felt truly awake. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew one thing. If I stayed, I would have to sign something. And if I signed, I might not get another chance to fix it. I walked into the darkness, leaving behind the house I had once believed was the safest place in my life, with a truth forming clearly in my mind, terrifyingly clear. Helen had been trying to tell me something before she died. And maybe she didn't die from illness. I walked a long distance before stopping. Not because I was tired, but because the images in my head began to rewind, slowly and painfully, like a film I couldn't turn off. Helen's funeral came back to me in sharp detail. I clearly remembered the moment Mark stood beside me in front of the casket. He was a little taller than me, broad-shouldered, standing firmly. Anyone looking would think he was a devoted son stepping up to carry his father's grief. But only I noticed his eyes. Not eyes filled with sorrow, but eyes that were waiting. He kept scanning the room, checking his watch, glancing toward the door. Whenever someone stayed with me a little too long, Mark would step in, gently placing a hand on my back as if out of concern, but his voice was low and hurried. "Are you okay, Dad? You should sit down and rest." Not a question, a push. Laura was different. She didn't stand next to me. She stood slightly back, always positioned to observe everything. Her eyes swept over each visitor, each handshake, each envelope placed on the condolence table. Nothing overt, but enough for someone who had lived more than 70 years to sense the calculation beneath it. There was a very brief moment when I turned and caught Laura's gaze. She wasn't looking at the casket at all. She was looking at Mark, and that look felt like a silent signal. as if to say, "Not yet." At the time, I didn't understand. Or rather, I didn't want to. After the service, while guests were still lingering, I heard Laura lean close to Mark and whisper. Her voice was very soft, but the room was quiet, and I was close enough. "It has to be done before the lawyer reads the will, as soon as possible." I froze. There was no grief in that sentence. It sounded like a task reminder. Dry, efficient, like talking about a contract that needed urgent signing. Mark nodded slightly. He didn't turn back to look at me. I stood there, my hands still resting on the edge of my wife's casket, the cold from the wood seeping into my palm. Part of me tried to reassure myself that I had misheard. Maybe Laura was just talking about funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, the small things younger people often handle for the elderly. But the sentence wouldn't leave my mind. Before the lawyer reads the will. Why the rush? I started paying closer attention, not with suspicion, but with the clarity of an old man suddenly realizing he had trusted calm and stability for too long. I noticed Mark avoiding my eyes whenever I looked directly at him. I noticed Laura answering questions for Mark, even when the questions weren't directed at her. And then heard something that, even now, makes my chest tighten. I was standing near the hallway leading to the back room of the funeral home. I was about to step inside to sit for a while when I heard Mark's voice. Not the voice he used with me. A rawer, lower voice. "The old man's confused," Mark said. "He won't notice. Just stick to the plan." I stood frozen. Laura replied quickly, without hesitation. "I know, but we still have to be careful. He's signed tons of paperwork for you before without asking." The old man's confused. I stood just a few steps away from them, feeling as if I had been pushed out of my own family. No one knew I was listening. No one turned around. That sentence hit me like a dull blade. Not sharp enough to kill instantly, but deep enough to keep bleeding for a long time. I turned away. Not because I was afraid they'd see me, but because I didn't have the strength to stand there another second. On the drive home after the funeral, with Mark behind the wheel, I stared out the window as trees slid past. I thought about my life, about winter mornings when I got up at 5 a.m. to work in the shop, hands cracked from the cold, back aching from hauling wood. I thought about the years Helen worked extra hours while I took every small job I could, just to make sure Mark could afford college. We were never rich, but we never let our child go without. When Mark graduated, I was the one who told Helen we should let him manage the family finances. "He's young, he understands the market better than we do," I had said. I handed him our savings account, small investments, even our yearly taxes, not because I was lazy, but because I trusted him. I believed my son would do better than I ever could. And for many years, everything seemed fine, at least on the surface, until the day Helen got sick. From then on, Mark stepped in to handle everything. He told me not to worry, just to stay by my wife's side. I listened. I always listened. Now, sitting alone in the dark, having left my familiar home behind, I was forced to face a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. If Mark wasn't the son I believed him to be, then what had I handed over to him all these years? Money was only part of it. Far more frightening was the power to decide, the power to control, and, perhaps, the power to destroy. The feeling of betrayal didn't come all at once. It seeped in slowly, layer by layer, like cold water soaking through a coat. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just felt my chest grow heavier, each breath a little harder than the last. For the first time in my life, I doubted my own son. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. No real words of comfort. No mention of his grief for his mother. No patience to wait until I was ready. Everything revolved around paperwork, time, before it was too late. I stood by the roadside and took a deep breath. The cold night air sharpened my senses. I realized I was no longer the man being protected in this family. I was becoming an obstacle. And when someone is seen as an obstacle, they get removed. That thought sent a shiver through me. I didn't know what I would face next. I only knew that from the moment I heard the words, "The old man's confused," everything had changed. The trust I built over a lifetime had cracked. And once it cracks, it never goes back to the way it was. I kept walking through the night, carrying a fear that was new and unfamiliar. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of realizing that the people closest to you might be the most dangerous. I stood by the roadside for a long time, until the traffic thinned and the sky turned a dull gray before dawn. Just then, my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. Not a casual check-in call. A sharp, rapid vibration. The kind that makes your heart jump before you even see the screen. Jonathan Reed. I saw his name and answered without thinking. "Richard." His voice came through, rough and low, as if he hadn't slept all night. "Where are you?" I didn't answer right away. I glanced around instinctively. The road was empty, only a few streetlights still on. "That doesn't matter," Jonathan continued, not waiting for my reply. "Listen to me. I just opened something Helen left behind, and I think you shouldn't go back home." My throat went dry. I tightened my grip on the phone. "What is it?" I asked, my voice sounding strange even to me, low and guarded. "I can't explain over the phone," Jonathan said, "but it involves Mark, directly, and it's more serious than I first thought." I closed my eyes for a few seconds. The morning breeze carried a faint chill. Part of me wanted to end the call, to say I couldn't handle any more secrets, but another part, the part that had heard the words, "The old man's confused," understood all too clearly that I no longer had the luxury of looking away. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "Come to my office." "Right now," Jonathan said. "And Richard, if Mark or Laura contact you, don't tell them where you are." I hung up without saying goodbye. I stood still for a moment before realizing my hands were shaking. The building where Jonathan worked wasn't far away. A tall glass structure, cold and sterile, nothing like the worn woodworking shop I'd known my entire life. I arrived just as daylight fully broke. The reception area was still quiet, the smell of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air. I suddenly felt nauseous. Jonathan met me at the elevator. He looked more worn than he had at the funeral. His tie was loose, dark circles under his eyes. He didn't look like an executive at all. "Thank you for coming," he said, and led me into his office. The room was spacious, but the curtains were drawn shut. On his desk sat a small, wall-mounted safe, already open. I recognized immediately that it wasn't a company safe. It was too personal, too discreet. "Helen asked me to keep it," Jonathan said, as if reading my thoughts. "She said if anything happened to her, I was to open it, but only if she died." I swallowed hard. "What's inside?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He took out an ivory-colored envelope, the edges slightly yellowed with age. On it, in handwriting so familiar it hurt, Helen had written, "If I die, give this to Richard. Don't let Mark see it." My knees went weak. Jonathan pulled out a chair and guided me down before I could react. I held the envelope with both hands. That handwriting, I could recognize it anywhere. Helen always wrote my name slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might hurt me with the ink itself. "She left more than this," Jonathan said quietly. "Not just the envelope. There are medical records, notes, and financial transactions I don't think you ever knew about." I opened the envelope, but I didn't read it yet. I needed a few seconds just to breathe. "Jonathan," I said without looking up, "tell me straight, what did Mark do?" He was silent for a long time. Then he let out a heavy breath. "Helen started suspecting Mark almost a year ago," he said. "At first I thought she was just under too much stress, but then she asked me to help investigate, quietly, unofficially." I looked up at him. "Investigate what?" "Money," Jonathan said. "And her health." The room seemed to shrink. I could hear my own heartbeat clearly. "Helen told me she started feeling unwell after Mark and Laura moved closer to your house," Jonathan continued. "Symptoms with no clear cause, fatigue, dizziness, weight loss. She saw several doctors, but nothing definitive showed up." I remembered clearly. Evenings when Helen sat silently at the dinner table, untouched coffee beside her. Quick frowns I dismissed as age catching up. "She was afraid," Jonathan said softly, "but not of illness. She was afraid someone was making her sick." I clenched the envelope. "And Mark?" Jonathan looked at me, hesitation in his eyes. "She didn't have direct proof, but she had suspicions, and she didn't want you to know until she was certain." I leaned back in the chair, feeling as if all the air had been pulled out of the room. Before I could say anything else, my phone vibrated. Mark. I looked at the screen. Jonathan saw it too. He shook his head slightly. I answered, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Where are you?" Mark asked, blunt as always. "Out for a walk," I said. "I needed some air." "Laura's waiting at home," Mark said. "There are some important papers. The lawyer will be here this afternoon." I stayed silent for a few seconds. Jonathan's words echoed in my head. "Don't tell them where you are." "I'm tired," I said slowly. "I need to rest. We'll talk tomorrow." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Mark laughed softly. "You're always like this, Dad. But these papers, they're just formalities. Once you sign, you won't have to worry anymore." I looked at the file Jonathan had just placed on the desk, copies of the documents Helen had kept. "I know," I said, "but I want to read them carefully." When I hung up, Jonathan was already standing. "Richard," he said, "they won't wait long." "Then I can't rush," I replied. I stood up and carefully slipped Helen's envelope into the inner pocket of my jacket. I hadn't read it yet. Not yet. I needed to keep something just for myself. One piece of truth Mark hadn't touched. When I left Jonathan's office, I already had a very simple plan. Not to fight back, not to confront, but to buy time. I would pretend to be weak, pretend to be tired, pretend to be the confused old man Mark thought I was. I would let them believe I was still the easily led father I'd been for years, because if Helen had hidden everything until the very end, then she must have known exactly who she was up against. And I understood that from this moment on, every signature of mine, every nod of agreement, could be the line between continuing to live or disappearing in a way that was perfectly legal. I went back home as the afternoon wore on. Pale sunlight slanted through the maple trees in the yard, light I once found warm, but now made everything feel distant and cold. The house was still there, unchanged, but the feeling when I stepped inside was completely different. As if I was no longer its owner, but a temporary occupant, waiting for someone else to decide my fate. Laura opened the door. She stood there gripping the doorframe, her face wearing a concern so gentle it was almost flawless. "You're back," she said softly. "I was so worried. You were gone all day without saying anything. We were afraid you'd exhausted yourself." I nodded without answering. I walked in, took off my jacket, hung it on the hook. Everything was still in its old place, yet something had been subtly disturbed. A picture frame shifted slightly, a stack of mail neatly reordered. Small details only someone who'd lived in a house for decades would notice. Laura followed me into the living room. She rested a hand on the back of a chair and bent down to my eye level. "You just lost Mom, and you're getting older," she said gently, like she was speaking to a child. "If you forget things sometimes, that's okay. We're here to take care of you." To an outsider, the words would have sounded touching, but I heard something else beneath them. Not concern, but direction. As if she were telling me how I should think about myself. Mark came out of the kitchen holding a cup of coffee. I stopped short, instinctively. Mark noticed and paused, then smiled. "Oh, you don't drink coffee, right?" he said. "I forgot. Laura, get Dad some tea." I stared at the coffee cup in his hand longer than necessary. Mark set it down without drinking. Laura quickly brought out tea, placed it in front of me, and sat down across from me. "Dad," Mark said, his voice low and deliberate. "This morning you said you agreed to sign already, don't you remember?" I looked up at him, The sentence was delivered so casually, like an established fact. "Agreed to what?" I asked. Mark frowned slightly, as if trying to recall something for me. "The papers from yesterday. You said you'd let us handle it. You even said you trusted us." Laura immediately chimed in, her tone full of sympathy. "You did say that. I remember clearly. You were just so tired. You probably don't remember." I sat still. For the first few seconds, I was genuinely confused. I searched my memory, trying to find a moment when I might have nodded or said something vague that could be taken as agreement. I remembered being exhausted. I remembered saying I wanted to rest, but I didn't remember agreeing to sign anything. The certainty in their voices made my own memory feel frighteningly fragile. "Maybe you're mistaken," Laura added, worry in her eyes. "You've been under so much stress lately. Mom passed away." She let the sentence trail off, letting the silence do the rest. A chill ran down my spine, not because of the words, but because of how they worked together. Each sentence Laura spoke opened a gap for Mark to place a new truth into, and vice versa. I began to doubt myself. Had I really agreed? Had I been so exhausted that I couldn't remember what I'd said? I was 71 years old. I had just lost my wife. I couldn't deny the possibility, and they knew that. That evening, I realized Mark and Laura had no intention of leaving. Their belongings were still in the apartment above the garage, where they used to stay temporarily when visiting. But now, the lights stayed on all night. I heard footsteps overhead at hours when I thought they'd be asleep. Mark said they were staying to take care of Dad. Laura said it like it was obvious, not something to be discussed. "You shouldn't be alone right now," she said. "What if you fall?" It sounded reasonable, but I began to feel like I had no private space. Every time I went into the kitchen, Laura was already there. Every time I stepped outside into the backyard, Mark appeared, asking where I was going. The questions were wrapped in concern, but repeated too often. They stopped being concern. They were surveillance. The air in the house grew thick. I spoke less, not because I didn't want to speak, but because every sentence was corrected, reinterpreted in a way that benefited them. "I'm tired," I said. "You're tired because you're not used to making these decisions," Mark replied. "I need time," I said. "You said that yesterday," Laura added, "and you agreed to let us handle it." Bit by bit, they took away my ability to assert myself, not by force, but by making me doubt my own perception. By the second night, I understood it clearly as I stood in the bedroom, looking at myself in the mirror. The man staring back at me looked older than I remembered, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes sunken. I wondered, if I don't trust myself, Who will? I heard the sound of a lock turning downstairs. Not a loud click, but a soft, practiced twist. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The stair light flicked on. "Do you need something?" Laura asked from below, startled at just the right moment. "No," I said, "I'm just getting some water." She smiled. "I'll get it for you. Don't walk around too much." I went back into the room and closed the door. For the first time, the house felt like a prison. No bars, no heavy locks, but every movement was watched. I sat on the bed, gripping the envelope Helen had left me, hidden in the jacket pocket hanging behind the door. I hadn't opened it yet, but just touching it made me feel a little steadier. Helen had anticipated this. I knew it. She had known I'd be surrounded by gentle words and carefully constructed truths. Near 3 a.m., I heard footsteps overhead. Then, the door to the garage apartment opened. Soft whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the rhythm of planning, not caregiving. I lay still, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. One thought filled my mind. If I stayed, they would keep twisting reality until I was no longer sure of any decision I made. And when someone is no longer sure, their signature becomes a weapon against them. I sat up very slowly, every movement light enough that I held my breath. I put my jacket back on, slipped Helen's envelope into the inner pocket. I didn't take a suitcase, no documents. I took only the most important thing I had left, my ability to decide for myself. I opened the bedroom door, went down the stairs, avoiding the steps that creaked, ones I'd known for decades. I went straight to the basement. The basement door opened, the hinges groaning softly like a sad farewell. When I stepped outside, the night air was bitter cold, but my mind was strangely clear. I didn't look back at the house. I was afraid that if I did, I'd hesitate. That night, I left my own home not like a man running away, but like someone who finally understood. If I didn't leave, I would slowly be erased from my own life, by fake kindness and sweet words more effective than any locked door. I left the house at exactly 3 a.m. Not because I chose that hour, but because my body woke up at that moment, as if an invisible clock had been wound long ago. The house was completely silent. No footsteps overhead, no whispers, only the faint sound of wind slipping through the basement window cracks. I stood on the last step, my hand resting on the wooden banister I myself had polished more than 30 years earlier. Part of me wanted to touch it one more time, out of habit. But I stopped. I was afraid that if I allowed myself to reminisce, I wouldn't be able to leave. The basement door opened quietly. The hinge made a small sound, enough to tighten my chest. I stood still for a few seconds, listening. Nothing else moved. I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me, carefully, almost absurdly so. I carried no belongings, no suitcase, no spare clothes, just my wallet and phone in my jacket pocket, and Helen's envelope hidden deep inside, pressed against my chest like a talisman. The night was colder than I expected. The cold seeped into my skin quickly, especially for an old man. But I didn't feel uncomfortable. I felt alert. A rare kind of clarity, where every sense sharpens, where even the smallest sound becomes vivid. I walked along the narrow path behind the house, where I used to take Mark to play when he was little. Every stone, every tree root was familiar. And yet, that night, I felt like a stranger, sneaking away from a place that had once belonged to me. That feeling was hard to name. Not exactly fear, not exactly sadness, but a quiet humiliation, realizing I was tiptoeing like a thief inside the very home I had paid for dollar by dollar to build, sweat by sweat to protect. I reached the main road while it was still dark. The streetlights were dim and far apart. I didn't have a car, didn't Mark had been driving mine for convenience since the funeral. I hadn't objected. Now, thinking back, I understood why. I walked a little farther until I saw the lights of the late-night bus station, a place I never imagined I'd end up at this hour. A few people were scattered around, mostly tired faces, heads down, carrying stories I didn't need to know. I stood by the ticket machine, then stopped. I didn't know where I should go. I only knew I needed to get as far away from that house as possible. I called a taxi. The car arrived 10 minutes later. A middle-aged man, quiet, asked me just one question. "Where to, sir?" I gave him the address of the building where Jonathan Reed worked. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. He didn't ask anything else. Maybe because I looked too dirty, too out of place for the hour and the destination. My jacket was smeared with mud from the path behind the house. My shoes were the same old pair I wore when I worked with wood. The car pulled away. I leaned my head against the window and watched houses slide past in the dark. I thought about Helen. I thought about what she would say if she saw me like this. Maybe she'd scold me for not bringing a warmer coat. Then she'd take my hand, the way she always did whenever I stepped into uncertain territory. Jonathan Reed's building came into view just as the sky began to lighten. A tall glass structure reflecting the pale gray morning. The lobby lights were on. A security guard stood straight by the entrance. I paid the driver and stepped out of the car. In that moment, I caught my reflection in the glass. An old man with gray hair, a mud-stained jacket, a hollowed face. I stood there, facing a world I had never belonged to, and I suddenly realized how stark that contrast was. I had spent my entire life working with my hands. Wood, nails, sweat. I was used to the smell of sawdust, the sound of a hammer. And this place, glass, steel, cold light, decisions made with signatures, not calluses. I walked into the lobby. The guard looked at me, then at the visitor list. Before I could speak, Jonathan appeared from the elevator, as if he had been waiting. "Richard," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "You made it." He led me quickly, no small talk, no pleasantries. We got into the elevator. The doors closed, the confined space making it a little hard to breathe. "Are you okay?" Jonathan asked, for the first time since I arrived. "I'm still standing," I replied. It was the most honest answer I had. When the elevator doors opened, I saw another man waiting inside Jonathan's office. Early 40s, neatly built, wearing a dark jacket. His eyes were sharp but not cold. The kind of eyes that were used to looking straight at the truth, even when it wasn't pleasant. "This is Evan Brooks," Jonathan said. "A private investigator." I looked at the man, then at Jonathan. "Helen hired him?" Jonathan nodded. Evan extended his hand. His handshake was firm, no excess. "I'm very sorry about your wife," he said. "No drama, no cliches." I nodded without speaking. Jonathan motioned for us to sit. He closed the office door and drew the curtains. The light in the room softened. "I'll be direct," Jonathan said. "What you're about to hear won't be easy. And once you hear it, there's no turning back." "Are you sure you want to continue?" I looked down at my hands. The calluses were still there even though I'd stopped working years ago. The calluses of a man who believed hard work and honesty were enough. I looked up. "I left my house at 3 a.m., I said slowly. "I think I've gone too far to turn back now." Evan looked at me, his expression unchanged. Jonathan let out a long breath. "All right," he said. "Then we begin." In that moment, I understood something very clearly. I had just stepped through a door I could never close again. Not just the door of this glass office, but the door into the truth about my family, about the son I had trusted my entire life. And even though I didn't yet know how brutal that truth would be, I knew I had no choice but to face it. The room stayed silent for a moment after Jonathan's words. Not an awkward silence, but a heavy one, as if the air itself was waiting for a truth to be placed on the table. I sat up straight in the leather chair, both hands resting on my knees, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wait," I said, turning to Evan. "You said you investigated. What exactly did Helen hire you to investigate?" Evan didn't answer right away. He looked at Jonathan as if waiting for a nod. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. Only then did Evan open his briefcase, take out a thin file, and place it on the table without opening it. "I know this is very hard to accept," Evan said calmly, "and I want to be clear from the start. I didn't follow your wife behind your back. I worked directly at Helen's request. She came to me on her own." The words sent blood rushing to my head. "What?" I shot up, slamming my hand onto the armrest. "Are you saying my wife hired someone to spy on her own family?" Jonathan stood up immediately. "Richard, please stay calm." "Calm?" I turned to him. "I lived with her my whole life. I slept beside her every night. If something was wrong, why didn't she tell me?" Evan didn't avoid my gaze. That was the first question I asked her too. I was breathing hard now. The anger wasn't explosive. It was a slow, burning heat, painful. The idea that Helen had kept something this big from me felt like a different kind of betrayal. Not the betrayal of greed, but the betrayal of silence. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice lower, heavier. Evan opened the file. Inside were handwritten notes. I recognized Helen's handwriting instantly. I didn't need to see her name, just the way she underlined words, the way she made careful, concise notes in the margins. "Helen said," Evan began, "that at first she thought it was stress, too much work, age. The symptoms were very vague." I sank back into the chair. Images of Helen in her final months came back to me, sitting quietly by the window, a hand resting on her stomach, a faint frown on her face. She was constantly tired, Evan continued. Dizzy in the mornings, her heart racing without reason. Some days her hands shook so badly she couldn't even hold a cup of tea. I nodded very slowly. I remembered. I had seen all of it, but I had explained everything with 2 words: old age. "She went to many doctors," Evan said. "The results were inconclusive, no specific underlying condition, but her numbers fluctuated strangely, sometimes almost normal, sometimes dropping very low." Jonathan cut in, his voice noticeably heavier. "Helen brought those results to me once. I thought she was worrying too much, until she said something I couldn't ignore." I turned to him more. "What did she say?" Jonathan looked straight at me. "She said, 'I don't believe this is random.'" The room fell silent again. Silent. Evan continued. "She started paying attention to her daily habits, especially what she ate and drank. And she realized something. Her worst symptoms usually appeared after mornings at home, after drinking coffee." My hands clenched. The image of the morning coffee cup, the familiar smell filling the kitchen, became painfully clear. When had Helen stopped drinking coffee? I couldn't remember exactly. I only remembered teasing her, saying she was getting sensitive with age. "She began avoiding it," Evan said, "but she didn't explain why. She didn't want to worry you." I closed my eyes. A dull ache spread across my chest. "And Mark?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Evan nodded slightly. "She didn't want to believe it. But the signs all pointed to him." I let out a dry laugh. "My son. The child I held when he was born. You're telling me my wife suspected her own son?" "Not at first," Evan said. "She fought that thought for a long time, but there were things she couldn't ignore." He flipped to another page in the file. Financial transactions. Money being moved out of joint accounts without her signature. Small amounts, very carefully spread out over time. I remembered. Mark had said he was optimizing our finances. I had trusted him. And most importantly, Evan said, slowing down, the toxicology test. I opened my eyes and looked straight at him. A test? Yes, Evan replied. Helen had herself tested, not through insurance, not under her real name. She suspected she was being exposed to something. My throat went dry. What were the results? Evan slid a copy of the report toward me. I didn't read every number. I only looked at the lines Helen had circled in red pen. There were traces of substances that shouldn't have been in her body, Evan said. Not enough to kill her immediately, but enough to accumulate. Enough to slowly weaken her. My hands dropped to my lap, as if all my strength had been drained. She told me one thing, Evan continued, his voice lowering. The thing that made me take the case immediately. I'm not afraid of dying, Evan repeated Helen's words. I'm afraid that if I die, Richard will be next. The sentence hit me like a blow to the chest. I bowed my head, covering my face with both hands. I didn't cry, but I couldn't breathe. Helen believed that if she disappeared, Evan said, the next person to benefit would be you. And if you were gone, then everything would be very clean. Jonathan stepped closer. Helen asked us to keep everything absolutely secret, even from you. She was afraid that if you knew, you'd confront them directly, and she believed that would put you in danger. I gave a bitter laugh. She was right. I remembered mornings when Helen stood in the kitchen watching me drink coffee. I remembered her eyes then, worried, but hidden. I remembered how she always asked if I felt tired, if I felt dizzy. I had thought it was the concern of an aging wife. I never imagined it was fear. She sacrificed a lot, Evan said. She continued drinking coffee for a time just to observe how her body reacted, just to gather more evidence. She didn't tell you because she knew you would stop her. I clenched my fists. And I did nothing. You didn't know, Evan said. And that's exactly why she chose silence. I looked up at the two men in front of me. One was my wife's boss. One was the man she trusted to uncover the truth. And I, the husband, was the last to know. In that moment, the anger drained out of me, replaced by something far heavier, regret. Helen had carried that fear alone. Faced the most horrific suspicion of her life, suspecting the very child she had raised without me by her side. I took a deep breath. She knew she was going to die, I said. It wasn't a question. Evan shook his head. No. But she knew she was very close to a dangerous line, and she prepared. I looked down at the envelope in my pocket, feeling its weight more clearly than ever. Not the weight of paper, but the weight of the truth Helen had carried to the very end. I understood something painfully clear and undeniable. That woman had quietly placed her own life on the scale, just to protect mine. And now that she was gone, it was my turn to continue what she hadn't been able to finish. Evan didn't speak right away. He opened his laptop, set it on the table between us, and turned the screen toward me. On it was a still frame, shot from above at a slight angle, clearly from a hidden camera. "This is your kitchen," Evan said. The camera was installed at Helen's request. She wanted it placed where no one would notice. It only records in the mornings. I stared at the screen. My heartbeat slowed as if my body were bracing itself for a blow. The familiar kitchen appeared, the wooden table I had built, the white cabinets Helen had chosen years ago, the coffee machine against the wall beneath the window overlooking the backyard. The timestamp appeared in the corner, 6:12 a.m. The kitchen door opened. Laura walked in. I held my breath. She was wearing a thin robe, her hair loosely tied back, her movements natural, not rushed, not sneaky, as if this were a routine task she'd done many times before. Laura opened the upper cabinet and took down a small white jar. No label, no writing. She glanced around for a second, then opened the lid. My hand began to shake. Laura tilted the jar and poured a very small amount of white powder into the coffee machine's filter compartment. The movement was decisive, precise. She tapped the bottom of the jar lightly to make sure all the powder fell out, then closed the lid and put the jar back exactly where it had been. It all happened in less than 10 seconds. "Stop," I said quietly. Evan paused the video. The image froze on Laura with her back to the camera, one hand resting on the coffee machine. I closed my eyes. In my head, the smell of morning coffee suddenly became so strong it made me nauseous. The smell I had considered the beginning of a normal day for decades. "This wasn't the only time," Evan said. "There are many clips like this. Different days, different times, but always the same motion." I opened my eyes and looked straight at the screen. What was that stuff? Evan didn't answer right away. He opened another file and slid it toward me. On the cover were lab results, the laboratory name, red stamps that I didn't need to read closely to understand how serious it was. "We took samples from the coffee machine," Evan said, "and from the last cup of coffee Helen kept." I looked up. "Kept?" Evan nodded. "She didn't drink it. She poured it, let it cool, and stored it." He pointed to the bolded text on the first page. "Arsenic," he said, "and warfarin." I'm not a doctor, but I don't need to be one to know those two names should never appear in anything I put into my body. I stared at the words in front of me as they quickly blurred. "The dosage wasn't enough to kill immediately," Evan continued, his voice steady, "but enough to cause slow damage, enough to make someone weaker, confused, lose control." I let the papers fall onto the table. In that moment, the scattered pieces in my mind began fitting together on their own. The sudden dizziness, the mornings when I had to sit down because my heart was racing, the times my hands shook so badly I couldn't hold my cup steady. I had laughed it off. I had told Helen it was old age. I had told Mark I was fine. I had been drinking that stuff for months. "How long?" I asked, my voice rough. "At least 6 months," Evan replied. "Possibly longer. It's hard to say exactly because each dose was very small." 6 months. I sat there, trying to remember how I had lived during the past 6 months. I remembered mornings when Helen didn't drink coffee with me. I remembered how she would just sip, then quietly pour it out when I wasn't looking. I remembered the way she watched me every time I lifted my cup. "Helen knew," I said. It wasn't a question. Evan nodded. "She knew, and she chose to grow weaker." That sentence shook me more than the lab results. "Weaker? How?" I asked. "She didn't resist right away," Evan said. "She wanted to be sure. She wanted proof. And she knew that if she appeared healthy, whoever was doing this would be more careful. But if she slowly weakened, they'd think the plan was working." I laughed, a hollow laugh, with no humor in it. "So she pretended to be sick?" "Not exactly," Evan replied. "She really was affected, but she didn't completely avoid it. She accepted enduring part of it, just to keep everything going long enough." I placed a hand on my chest. My heartbeat was slow and steady. I thought about the times Helen urged me to see a doctor, the times she insisted I cut back on coffee. I had brushed it off. I had thought she was worrying too much. "The last cup of coffee," I said. "Where is it?" Evan stood up, walked to the filing cabinet behind him and took out a sealed clear container. Inside was a light blue ceramic mug. I recognized it instantly. The mug Helen liked to use in the mornings, a tiny chip on the rim from when I had dropped it years ago. "She kept this cup," Evan said. "She didn't wash it. She didn't pour it out. She said if anything happened to her, this would be the first thing we needed to test." I stared at that mug for a long time. The coffee inside was gone, leaving only a dry, brown ring at the bottom. Something so ordinary, so familiar, and deadly. "She didn't want you to know," Evan said quietly. "Not until everything was clear enough. She was afraid that if you knew too early, you'd confront them directly. And if you confronted them, you'd become the next target." I closed my eyes. A clear image appeared in my mind. Helen standing in the kitchen, her back to me, one hand on the counter, breathing slowly. I had asked if she was okay. She had turned, smiled, and said she was just a little tired. That wasn't tiredness. That was endurance. "Why didn't she leave?" I asked, almost whispering. "Why didn't she tell me so we could leave together?" Evan was silent for a few seconds. "She thought about it. But she knew. If she left too early, everything would be wiped clean. No evidence, no trail, and the person behind it would never be touched." Jonathan spoke for the first time in a long while. "Helen said something to me once. I think you should hear it." I looked up. "She said," Jonathan recalled, "if I disappear without leaving anything behind, Richard will live with doubt for the rest of his life. I don't want him to live like that." Those words cut straight through me. My throat tightened. Helen hadn't only been thinking about survival. She had been thinking about how I would live if she were gone. I lowered my head. My hands clenched so tightly my nails dug into my skin. "I thought I was the one protecting my family," I said quietly. Turns out, the one protecting me was her. Evan said nothing. Neither did Jonathan. They let that truth settle between us, heavy, undeniable. I opened my eyes and looked again at the mug in the sealed container. An ordinary morning, a familiar cup of coffee, and a plan that had lasted for months, unfolding right in front of me, inside the kitchen I believed was the safest place in the world. In that moment, I understood the final truth, painfully clear. Helen had saved me with her own life, not through a loud, heroic act, but through patience, silence, and a decision only someone who loved deeply could make. And from the moment I saw that video, saw that cup, I knew my life had turned down a path with no return. No more doubt, no more pretending to be weak. The truth was there, bare and cold, waiting for me to do what Helen hadn't been able to finish. After the video ended, no one spoke for a very long time. I sat there, staring at the mug in the sealed container, trying to fit the remaining pieces of truth into a picture that was already clear in shape, but still left me breathless. Evan broke the silence first. He closed the laptop, his voice lower, different from when he had been presenting evidence. "There's one more part," he said. "Probably the part Helen was most afraid of." I didn't look up right away. "About Mark?" "Yes." Evan opened another file. This one was thicker, more papers. Bank statements, credit reports, dense lines of text I had left my son to handle for years. "Mark isn't just in financial trouble," Evan said slowly. "He's deeply in debt." I looked up. "How much?" "Over $2 million, Evan replied. "Mostly gambling, sports betting, some underground casinos, and a few high-interest loans." $2 million. The number itself didn't shock me as much as the fact that I had known nothing about it. I had always thought Mark just spent a little too freely. I had believed him when he said his investments were poorly timed. I had believed him when he blamed market volatility. "Helen discovered this before you did," Evan said. About 3 years ago. I closed my eyes. I pictured Helen sitting quietly at the dinner table, more withdrawn than usual. She had known since then. Known her son was sliding down a slope with no brakes. She didn't tell you, Evan continued, not because she didn't trust you, but because she was afraid you'd confront Mark immediately, and Mark would react in a dangerous way. Jonathan nodded in agreement. Helen came to see me many times. She asked how to protect the assets without Mark realizing it. I opened my eyes, Arturo. Which assets? Your retirement fund, Evan said, and several joint accounts Mark was managing. My hands tightened. You mean? Mark had been embezzling, Evan said bluntly. Not once. Over many years. Small amounts, spread out, very hard to catch without close scrutiny. The room seemed to tilt. I remembered the times Mark said he needed a temporary advance from the fund. The times he told me to sign papers quickly because it was just a technical adjustment. I had signed. I always signed. Helen found out, Evan said, and she stopped it. How? I asked, my voice hoarse. She quietly changed access permissions, Evan replied. Moved part of the assets into accounts only she and Jonathan knew about. She also began saving evidence. I lowered my head. So that's when Mark lost control. Evan didn't answer immediately, he just looked at me. That look told me I was very close to the truth. When Helen cut off the cash flow, Evan said slowly, Mark had no other options. Creditors began applying pressure, heavy pressure, and fast. Jonathan added, his voice grave, Helen told me she was afraid, not for herself, for you. I gave a bitter laugh. Again, me. Yes, Jonathan said, because Mark knew she would never put you in danger if there were any other choice, and that was her only weakness. I looked up, my heart pounding. You're saying Mark decided to eliminate Helen first? Evan nodded. That's what we believe. The air in the room grew thick. My ears rang. I had prepared myself for many things, but not for this thought, that my son had chosen to kill his own mother. But he couldn't stop there, Evan said, because if Helen died, the next person controlling the assets would be you. I understood immediately, and I wouldn't be easy to control if I was clear-headed. Exactly, Evan said. So Mark's plan had 2 tracks. One was to weaken Helen until she couldn't fight back. The other was to weaken you at the same time. Coffee, white powder, small, steady doses. A chill ran down my spine. And the final part, Evan said, his voice dropping even lower, was the exit strategy. I looked straight at him. What kind of exit? Mark prepared a fake confession, Evan said. A handwritten note taking full responsibility. Poisoning, embezzlement, financial manipulation, then suicide. I jumped to my feet. No, not to die, Evan said quickly. To disappear. He flipped to another set of papers. Fake passports, one-way plane tickets, offshore accounts, everything was ready. I was breathing fast. What about me? Evan looked me straight in the eye. You would have taken the blame. The words left me frozen. The plan was this, Evan said, his voice flat, like reading from a cold report. Mark leaves the confession, subtly implying that you had lost control due to age and illness. You were the one making the coffee. You were the one signing the documents. You were the one with motive because of the assets. Jonathan added, and given your health at that point, it would have been very hard for you to defend yourself. I remembered the dizzy spells, The moments I forgot things, the times I needed Mark to speak for me with lawyers. It had all been the perfect foundation for a different story. An elderly man, Evan said, with declining cognition, grieving his wife, making a series of mistakes that led to tragedy. And the son, heartbroken, remorseful, then gone. I sank back into the chair, feeling as if my spine could no longer hold me upright. I understood why the plan had been nearly perfect. No one would have suspected Mark. No one would have suspected Laura. And I had already begun to doubt myself. Helen saw the entire script, Evan said, and she chose to stop it at the root. I swallowed hard. By enduring it. By sacrificing, Evan corrected. I remembered Helen's eyes in her final days, not the eyes of someone desperate, but the eyes of someone who had made a very clear decision. She knew she was walking on a blade, and she walked anyway, step by step, just to buy time. Mark's plan was very tight, Jonathan said. If not for the evidence Helen left behind, it would have worked. I sat there in silence. In my mind, I no longer saw a faceless traitor, but the image of a child I once held in my arms, now the architect of a scheme so ruthless it had nearly swallowed me whole. Almost perfect, I repeated, my voice dry. Evan nodded. Yes, almost. I looked down at my hands, the calluses, the old scars, a lifetime of honest work, believing that family was the safest place of all. I never imagined I would be sitting in a glass room, listening to strangers explain why my own son had planned to destroy both his father and his mother. In that moment, I was no longer angry. The only feeling left was a cold clarity, the kind that comes only after every illusion has collapsed. Mark's plan was almost perfect, but Helen had seen the one flaw in it, and that flaw was the reason I was still alive, sitting here, hearing this truth. After all the pieces were laid out on the table, Evan closed the file and sat silently for a long time. Jonathan stood by the window, looking outside but clearly seeing nothing. The room sank into a taut, wire-tight silence, the kind that appears only when everyone understands there is no turning back from the next step. "We need to catch them in the act," Evan finally said. "Not assumptions, not theories, red-handed." I looked up. "You mean Mark and Laura won't confess," Evan said. "People like them only make mistakes when they think they're about to win." Jonathan turned back, his voice dropping. "If we want this to end, we have to let them expose themselves. And there's only one way." I knew what they were going to say before they said it. The feeling sent a chill down my spine. "You have to go back home," Evan said. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, thinking about that kitchen, that coffee machine, that wooden table. I had left that house like a fugitive. Now I had to return as bait. "The police will be standing by," Evan continued. "We've already had preliminary discussions, but they need direct evidence. They need the act itself, not just documents." Jonathan stepped closer. "Richard, I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. But if you don't do this, Mark's plan could still continue, just in another way." I closed my eyes. I thought of Helen, thought of how she had accepted growing weaker, accepted the risk just to preserve evidence. I couldn't do less than she had. "I'll go back," I said, "but on my terms." The plan was laid out quickly, but every detail was weighed carefully. I would return home in exactly the state Mark and Laura expected, broken, exhausted, confused. A father who had just lost his wife, panicked after leaving in the night, now returning because he had nowhere else to cling to. They wouldn't question it. They had believed I was weak for a long time. I returned the following afternoon. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low. When I opened the front door, Laura was the first to see me. She froze for a fraction of a second, a reflex she couldn't hide, then immediately stepped forward, her face filling with concern. "Where did you go?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough. "We were so worried." I let my shoulders slump and sighed. I don't know. My head's a mess." Mark appeared behind her. His eyes swept over me quickly, from head to toe, as if checking whether I was still intact. "It's good you're back," he said. "You scared us." I didn't look directly at him. I walked slowly into the house and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, sitting down as if my legs could barely hold me. I saw Laura glance at Mark, quickly. A familiar exchange of looks. "We thought you got lost," Laura said. "Or maybe you forgot your phone." I shook my head and pressed a hand to my forehead. "I'm so tired, my head's spinning. I guess I haven't been eating or drinking much these past few days." Mark stepped closer. "You should rest. Let me make you some coffee." I looked up at him. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice just shaky enough. "Yeah. I need coffee, to clear my head." In that moment, I saw a very slight change in Mark's eyes. Not joy, not worry, but relief, like a gear in his mind had just clicked into place. As Mark turned toward the coffee machine, I lowered my head, hiding my eyes. I knew Evan and his team had already been inside the house earlier, while Mark and Laura were away. A small camera was hidden behind the spice jar. A microphone was attached under the dining table. Everything was live. I heard Laura pull out a chair and sit across from me. "Are you okay?" she asked, placing her hand on mine, warm enough to pass for concern. "No," I said truthfully, in another sense. "I'm not okay." Mark stood in front of the coffee machine. I didn't need to look to know every move. I had seen them in the video. I knew them by heart. He opened the cabinet, took out the small white jar, looked around. I heard the soft twist of the lid. Time seemed to slow down. Every second passed with painful clarity. I sat there, feeling cold sweat gather at the back of my neck. Part of me wanted to jump up, scream, smash that coffee machine, but I didn't. I couldn't. Helen hadn't. The sound of powder falling into the compartment was faint. If you didn't know, you'd never notice. Mark closed the lid and pressed the button. The machine started to run, making its familiar hum. The smell of coffee spread through the air, mixed with a faint metallic scent I had never noticed before. Mark turned back, carrying the cup, and set it in front of me. "Careful, it's hot," he said. I looked at the cup. A thin layer of foam, dark brown. No different from the thousands of cups I'd drunk in my life. "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. Laura stared at me, waiting. I lifted the cup. My hand trembled just slightly, enough to look like an exhausted old man. In that moment, I knew exactly where I was standing, not in a kitchen, but on the line between life and death, between truth and a lie that had lasted for years. I raised the cup toward my mouth. The familiar aroma filled my nose, twisting my stomach. I thought of Helen, thought of the cup she had kept, thought of every morning she had stood watching me drink. I dropped the cup. The crash of breaking ceramic rang sharply. Hot coffee spilled across the table and dripped onto the floor. Laura jumped to her feet. Mark cursed under his breath. "Dad!" Laura cried. "What's wrong?" I gasped, clutching my chest. I'm dizzy." Mark rushed over. "Are you okay?" I looked up at him, my eyes confused. Can you make me another one? I spilled it." In that instant, I saw a flicker of hesitation in Mark's eyes. Very brief, but real. Then he nodded. Okay. He turned back to the coffee machine, and for the second time, on camera, on microphone, in front of everything Helen had sacrificed to preserve, Mark opened the cabinet, took out the white jar, and did exactly what he believed no one could witness. I sat there, my heart pounding like a war drum. This was no longer a performance. This was the moment of truth. I knew that when the second cup of coffee was finished, when Mark set it on the table, nothing could be denied anymore. And in that moment of waiting, as the coffee machine began to hum again, I realized I had never been so close to the truth, and never so close to death. The sound of the coffee machine running the second time felt completely different from the first, not because the sound had changed, but because I was hearing it with a different state of mind. I sat still in my chair, both hands resting on the table, feeling every heartbeat in my chest. No more confusion, no more doubt, only the cold waiting of someone who had reached the very end of the road. Mark stood with his back to me, his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. I noticed it. Laura stood by the sink, gripping the kitchen towel tightly, her eyes fixed on Mark as if watching a familiar ritual. Neither of them looked at me then. I remembered the moment the first cup shattered on the floor, the ceramic breaking apart, coffee spreading like a dark stain. If I hadn't dropped it then, if I had tried to drink it, everything might have ended differently. I didn't let myself think further. I stayed in the present. Mark opened the cabinet, took out the white jar. I clearly heard the twist of the lid, a tiny sound, but in the quiet kitchen it rang like a confession. Mark glanced around quickly. His eyes flicked to Laura, then rested on me for a split second, just long enough to check whether I was still alert. I let my eyelids droop, pretending to be exhausted. An old father who had just spilled his coffee, struggling to sit upright. I saw Mark relax. He tilted the jar and tapped it lightly. White powder fell. Not too much, not too little. Exact. I heard Laura inhale softly, not out of fear, but anticipation. The coffee machine ran. Steam rose. The familiar smell spread, making my stomach clench. I thought of Helen, thought of how she had endured this smell every morning, knowing it could kill her. Thought of the way she looked at me, not the look of a weak woman, but of someone watching time itself. Mark turned off the machine and picked up the second cup. His hand was steady, not shaking. He turned and set it down in front of me. "Careful this time, Dad," he said, his voice gentler than necessary. I looked at the cup. Thin foam, dark brown. Everything exactly the same. And that was the most terrifying part. "Thank you," I said, reaching toward it. That moment lasted less than a second, but to me it felt like a void opening between two worlds. I could drink, I could refuse, I could spill it again, but I didn't need to do anything. Because the front door suddenly burst open. Footsteps rushed through the quiet house, shoes hit the floor, voices shouted, loud, firm. Laura spun around, her face going pale. Mark froze, the cup still untouched on the table. "Police!" Everything happened fast, too fast for Mark to process. Two officers entered the kitchen, Evan right behind them. His eyes never left the cup of coffee. Laura let out a short, piercing scream and stumbled backward into the cabinets. Mark reacted on instinct, turning toward the back door that led to the yard. But before he could run, an officer blocked his path. "Stay where you are," the officer said. Not loud, not harsh, but leaving no room for argument. Mark stopped. In that moment, I saw real panic on my son's face for the first time. Not fake concern, not calculation, but raw fear of someone dragged into the light. "What is this?" Mark said quickly, his voice unsteady. "You don't have the right—" Evan stepped forward and pointed at the coffee cup. "We do." One officer put on gloves and carefully lifted the cup, sealing it in an evidence bag. Another moved to the coffee machine, removed the compartment, and seized the white jar from the cabinet. Laura began to cry. Not loud sobbing, but broken, choking sounds. She kept repeating, "It wasn't me. I didn't know. I didn't know." Mark turned toward her. That look, I will never forget it, was not the look of a worried husband. It was the look of someone betrayed by his own accomplice. "Shut up," Mark snapped. "You ruined everything." The words dropped into the kitchen like a heavy object. Laura stopped crying and stared at him, her mouth open but no words coming out. An officer read their rights. Each sentence, each word, clear and unhurried. Mark stood still, eyes wide, as if unable to believe everything was collapsing so quickly. Laura sank to the floor, clutching her head. "We have enough evidence," Evan said calmly. "Video, toxicology, physical evidence. Statements will come later." Mark turned to me. For the first time since the police entered the house, he looked straight into my eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice rough. "You don't understand." I looked back at him. I saw clearly the face of the child I once held, and even more clearly the face of the man standing before me now. The two images overlapped, painful and impossible to reconcile. "I understand now," I said. My voice didn't shake. "I understand too late." Mark shook his head, laughing crookedly. "You always thought you understood, but you never—" "That's enough," an officer said, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Turn around." The handcuffs snapped shut with a dry, metallic sound. Laura cried out at the sight. Mark didn't resist anymore. The tension drained from his body, leaving him hollow. They led Mark out first. As he passed me, he paused for a brief moment. No apology, no pleading, just a quick look, full of resentment and exhaustion. Then he moved on. Laura was taken out next. She turned back, searching for my eyes as if trying to cling to whatever remained. I didn't look away. I looked straight at her. Not to punish, but to end it. When the door closed, the house became strangely quiet. Everything was still there, the dining table, the cabinets, the coffee machine. But it felt as if a heavy layer of air had been pulled away, revealing a deeper, harder emptiness underneath. Evan stood beside me. "Are you okay?" I nodded slowly. I didn't know if I was okay. I only knew I was still standing. I looked down at the table where the coffee cup had been taken away. A brown stain remained on the wood. I reached out and touched it, feeling the cooling surface of the liquid that had once been so familiar. "You did the right thing," Evan said. I didn't answer right away. I thought of Helen, thought of what she would say if she were here. Maybe she wouldn't say anything at all. She would just place her hand over mine, the way she always did. I faced the most painful truth of my life in that kitchen, that the person I had trusted for a lifetime had planned to destroy his own family, and that the person I loved had sacrificed everything to stop it. There was no victory in that moment, only the truth, and its price, heavier than any sentence. The trial took place on a gray morning, the kind of weather people remember for a long time afterward. I sat in the witness section, my hand resting on the cane I had begun using more often these past months. Not because I had grown weak too quickly, but because everything had taken more from me than I realized. Strength, sleep, and the things I once believed were unchangeable. Mark and Laura sat on the other side, only a few yards away, yet it felt like another world. They didn't look at me when they entered. Laura kept her head bowed low, her hands clasped together until her knuckles turned white. Mark sat upright, staring straight ahead, his face cold, as if this were merely an inconvenient administrative process. From the very first day, they began turning on each other. Mark's attorney argued that Laura was overly controlling, that she was the one who took initiative in all matters related to household routines. Laura's attorney countered, claiming she only followed her husband's instructions, that Mark handled the finances and made all decisions. Two people who once stood side by side in my kitchen now sat apart, each constructing a different story, trying to push the blame onto the other. I listened without interrupting. I didn't need them to confess in front of me. I only needed the truth to be placed where it belonged. On the third day of the trial, the prosecutor presented the confession Mark had prepared. A handwritten note, the handwriting deliberately shaky, admitting to personal mistakes, and an intention to end his life out of remorse. As the lawyer read each line aloud, the courtroom fell silent. "Do you recognize this handwriting?" the judge asked me. "I recognize it," I replied. "Not my son's handwriting when someone is desperate. It's the handwriting of someone staging a scene." The prosecutor presented a handwriting analysis, comparing it to Mark's old documents. The differences were clear. The passages that sounded remorseful had been clumsily added. The lines implying an out-of-control father were planted very carefully. The plan to destroy my reputation, an old man who had just lost his wife and was experiencing cognitive decline, slowly unfolded before the court, exposed and undeniable. Then came the evidence presentation. The kitchen video was played on the large screen, the familiar angle, the familiar coffee machine, the mornings that once seemed ordinary. The entire courtroom held its breath when Laura appeared in the frame, holding the white jar and pouring powder into the machine. Another clip showed Mark repeating the exact same action, calm and precise. I didn't watch the screen for long. I looked down at my hands. I had already seen those clips. I didn't need to watch them again to know how deeply the truth hurt. When the forensic results were read aloud, arsenic and warfarin, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Laura began to shake. She kept shaking her head over and over, as if denying it long enough might make everything disappear. When it was Laura's turn to testify, she collapsed. Her voice broke from the very first sentence. I didn't want it to be like this," she said, tears spilling out. "I just did what I was told. I was scared." She talked about the debts, the pressure from creditors, the nights Mark couldn't sleep, the way everything slowly slipped out of control. She confessed to what she had done in the kitchen, to pouring the powder into the machine, to watching me drink coffee every morning. Each sentence cut like a blade, but I didn't look away. "He knew I would never report him," Laura said, pointing toward me. "He thought, you would never believe that about your own son." Mark sat still, unmoving. When it was his turn to stand, there were no tears, no trembling, only a cold emptiness. "Do you have anything to say?" the judge asked. Mark stared straight ahead. "Everyone has a price," he said. "I just chose the cheapest way to pay it." The courtroom seemed to freeze. I heard someone gasp somewhere behind me. I looked at Mark, the child I once taught to ride a bike, the boy I sat beside when he had a high fever, and I no longer recognized that person. The sentence was handed down that afternoon. Life imprisonment, no parole. When the judge finished reading, Laura collapsed into her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. Mark didn't turn to look at me. The handcuffs were locked again, this time not as a shock, but as the official end of every possible road. I stood when the trial ended. My legs shook slightly, but I remained upright. Evan stood behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder without saying a word. I nodded in thanks and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted across the courthouse steps. I stopped there for a long time. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. I had lost my wife. And in that courtroom, I understood something no sentence could change. I had lost my son forever. Not because of prison, but because of the person he had chosen to become. I walked down the steps slowly. Each step felt like a period placed at the end of a chapter of my life. I knew that from now on, there would be no familiar smell of coffee in the mornings, no sound of Helen calling me from the kitchen. But at least I knew that the truth, no matter how cruel, had not been buried. And that was the only thing I still had left. I survived. That was the clearest truth, and also the hardest one to accept. After the trial, after the sentence, after the newspaper headlines slowly faded, life didn't collapse in a loud, dramatic way the way people imagine. It simply became empty. Like a house after everything has been moved out, still standing but without warmth. I returned to the old house for a short time just to gather what I needed. The kitchen was the same. The wooden table I had built. The window looking out to the backyard. The coffee machine had been sealed and taken away as evidence, leaving a clear rectangular space on the counter. I stood there for a long time, staring at that empty space, realizing that some voids can never be filled. Helen was gone, and Mark was gone too. Gone in another way that hurt even more than death. I lost my wife, the woman who stood by me for 44 years, who discovered the most terrifying truth of her life and still chose silence to protect me. I lost my son, not because of a life sentence, but because of the choices he had made long before he was arrested. The family I believed was the safest place in the world no longer existed. The first nights after everything, I barely slept. Not because of nightmares, but because ordinary moments kept replaying. Helen standing in the kitchen with her back to me, asking if I wanted a little more sugar in my coffee. Mark as a child, running into the backyard, scraping his knee and bursting into tears. Those memories don't hurt because I remember them. They hurt because I didn't fully understand their meaning when I still could. Gradually, I began reading what Helen had left behind. The envelope she wrote for me, I opened very late. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew that once I read it, I could never go back to being the carefree man I had been before. Inside, there were no long farewells. Just a few pages, her familiar handwriting, calm in a way that felt almost unreal. Helen wrote that she didn't want me to carry hatred. That the truth, no matter how brutal, was still better than a lifetime lived in lies. That if I was reading her words, it meant I was still alive, and that was enough. She wrote that she had fought until her last breath, not to win, but to keep me from becoming the next victim of blind greed. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw it simply as the duty of a wife. Only then did I fully understand what Helen had done. She didn't die because she was weak. She died because she endured. She wasn't silent out of fear. She was silent out of calculation. And she didn't sacrifice herself to be remembered. She sacrificed herself because she loved. The price of blind greed is not just a life sentence. It is the complete destruction of relationships that once seemed unbreakable. It turns people into strangers within their own families. And worst of all, it convinces them that they have the right to decide another person's fate. I learned something very late in life. The truth always finds a way to surface. It may be slow, it may take a winding path, but it doesn't disappear. And those who betray us rarely wear terrifying faces. They wear the sweetest smiles, the most familiar voices, and they stand very close. Living on with the truth isn't easy. There are mornings when I wake up by habit, ready to make coffee for 2 people. There are evenings when I forget that no one is waiting for me at the dinner table anymore. But I've learned to accept those moments, to not push them away, not cover them up with meaningless busyness. I live more slowly now. I walk more. I talk to strangers more easily, perhaps because I no longer have anything to hide. I carry my story not to complain, but to remind myself that clarity is a gift, and trust must be placed carefully. I don't know if, given another chance, I could have done anything differently. Probably not. But I do know that Helen did everything she could, in her own way. And the rest is what I have to live with. If you've listened this far, if you're sitting alone in your familiar room, perhaps with a cup of tea or cold coffee beside you, I want you to know how truly grateful I am. Not everyone has the patience to listen to a story without a perfectly happy ending. Where are you watching this story from? What do you think about greed, about betrayal, when it comes from the people closest to us? If you've ever faced a painful truth, how did you choose to keep living afterward? Leave a few lines of your thoughts. I read every comment, and I believe that every story shared helps someone feel a little less alone. Thank you for staying until this moment. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and stay with me. There are still other stories, not to frighten you, but to remind us to stay aware and to cherish what we still have while we still can.